We'll, let us continue with our conversation, Dr. Ellis. And this time, I would like to uh, talk to you about, your famous PowerPoint, because last time in class, you again presented your story through your PowerPoint with all the photos. Very interesting. I mean, I have seen that many times when you were here in 2016, and you basically start your presentation with that. And to be honest, I find that at the beginning uh, quite strange. I mean, that.
Yes, I have been thinking about it lately because it became the typical way I shared my presentations around the world. We had this phase of me going to Israel, Palestine, and just searching out, and then back in '84 and then '86, writing toward a Jewish theology of liberation, and then moving on through the First Intifada and beyond. And after the Second Intifada, where things looked like they were never going to get better, the First Intifada, there was hope. So in the 2000s, early 2000s, there was a sense that, I had a sense that it wasn't going to go anywhere. And PowerPoint had just come into being, as far as I knew. And I was expected when I traveled to have a PowerPoint. Everybody asked me about my PowerPoint. So I had to develop one, and I had been narrating Jewish history through the lens of the Holocaust and Israel and Palestine in my writing. But now I was being asked, and I was interested once I was asked, in a visualization, rather than the written text, a visualization of this narrative. And when I thought about how to narrate in a more visual way through the Holocaust, through Israel, I also began to think, since I had been traveling Jewish so long and now was coming back again around the world, and people were so interested in what is a Jew and who is a Jew and how are you Jewish, were your parents Jewish, all of these questions. I thought, well, I'll tell my story not as an egocentric thing, this is me, this is me, this is me, but as a way of showing how I entered into this discussion of the Holocaust, Israel, Palestine, and show also the people I encountered both through written texts and encountered personally during this journey for good and for ill. And I discovered my bar mitzvah pictures, my early childhood pictures, and my certificates from Hebrew school in the late 50s and early 60s where, at one point I was lauded for being an excellence in history and then attendance, which means I had dropped off. And at the same time, thinking back, I realized and started writing during the Second Intifada that we in the Jewish world were involved in a civil war within what I call the Jewish Civil War. And so I started to show photographs of Holocaust theologians with some quotes from them. And it gave the people in the audience a chance to look at these people. They were real people, not just names. And then going to Israel, traveling through Israel, talking about Israel, showing photos of Israel. And then the divisions within the Jewish community over Israel, Palestine, and I divided it into Constantinian Jews, progressive Jews, and Jews of conscience. And then I realized it was very important for the audience to see maps of Israel, Palestine, and what was going on, especially in the West Bank. And I started there with the Oslo agreements and showed maps from then until the time I was giving the PowerPoint and how things really hadn't changed and that Palestinian life was becoming worse. So in the Constantinian Jews, I showed photos, and the progressive Jews, I showed photos and discussed people, and Jews of conscience, so I showed myself as looking at the world, but the world was populated way beyond me. And then the maps were the clincher. I didn't realize it at first, but once people didn't hear only about what was going on, but actually saw it, and then the wall, maps of the wall, and I mean, it was devastating. So the PowerPoint went around the world, and I think I started PowerPoint. I can find parts of it going back to 2006 and maybe even before, but also my travels around the world and showing other hotspots where I brought a Jewish theology of liberation. So the PowerPoint was a way of showing that a real person like me, explored Jewish life through these encounters and talked about other people who I was encountering and their views and where we were going as a people.
Yeah. So I just thought that was, that was very brave in a way. And don't you feel so vulnerable with showing,
Well,
showing photos of yourself, your background, and how
no,
ordinary you were, and yeah.
I think that's the point. And I think the groups that saw me would really identify, well, also sense of humor. I had the bar mitzvah picture, the first one very serious, and then my mother told me to smile. So we had fun. And they had a lot of fun in general, seeing that a professor who was so serious actually lived a life. I had a childhood. I had a photo of me playing with a baseball glove that was bigger than I was at that time. And that opened people that it wasn't going to be just a bump, 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 but an exploration with a real human being and other human beings. And we could also laugh, although the content was very serious, but especially the childhood, people got a kick out of seeing that I went to Hebrew school and that I was, lauded for my history, but then attendance, and, you could make jokes about it. And I think that was important, not only for them, but for me. I realized that the PowerPoint and the colors in the PowerPoint, the visualization was very important for me on my travels. It gave me sort of a community I was traveling with, even though it was a PowerPoint. I felt I was in very different places, from India and Pakistan and Malaysia and all over the world. And I traveled alone. And this was like a community. And so the narration that I had started in toward a Jewish theology of liberation, and I kept going, now reached another level. And also, as I realized all of it was going to fail, I think that was very important to come back to the personal journeying through time and the question of what does it mean to be faithful as a Jew? And the audience could think, what does it mean to be faithful for me and them? By sharing my vulnerability, there were people who heard it and saw it who could be more vulnerable too. And that was a bond in general. So it was a lot of fun. And of course, I kept adding and adding. And if I did the whole PowerPoint, it would take hours and hours and hours. But I would go for an hour and a half, and people, because of the visualization, where they couldn't have listened to a lecture for an hour and a half, it was extremely intense. And we could go back to the PowerPoint photos. When somebody asked about Holocaust theology, we could go back there, or the maps, we could go back there and show. So it became, I haven't done it in a while, except through Zoom recently, but I sort of miss it because it was my community on the road.
Your community under. Let me go back to the Holocaust theologians that you mentioned there, and I guess my question is, why them? And because I'm sure there were others who have written a lot about the Holocaust, but why them? I mean, Rubinstein, Wiesel, Arendt, Greenberg, and what's
Well,
the criteria?
Yeah, well, I was the first one. There are people who wrote about these figures, some of them actually, not much, except Wiesel was famous, so people would write about him, but very uncritically. Uh, I was the first person to really take these theologians seriously, not only in reference to the Holocaust, but how the Holocaust functioned in their writings in terms of Jewish empowerment and Israel, and the absence of Palestinians in their Holocaust drama, or the Palestinians as threats. So I was the first person, as far as I know, and certainly the most consistent person in terms of emphasizing that the Holocaust was also important for the formation of Israel. And those who talk about only colonialism and all of that miss a point. In Jewish history, the suffering in Europe and the mass murder of Jews was devastating. And I understand the reason that some believed we needed an independent Jewish state for our own empowerment, because we had been in other situations where we had no power. And therefore we were weak and vulnerable. But so I am in the middle on this. In terms of the Holocaust, I understand why there's a state of Israel. But Holocaust theologians didn't ask the next question, and I asked it. How could we do this to Palestinians? Not against Jewish empowerment, and not against, in and of itself, a Jewish state. Whether we need a Jewish state or not is another question, but I'm not against an empowered community, really, because Israel is such a small state. It's very small in number compared to a state in the United States, for instance, one state. So the Holocaust was very important, and they were right to talk about Jewish empowerment, but they were wrong to bury Palestinians. And I had to ask the next question, but the next question only makes sense if we're going to go deep, if we ask the prior question too. What's dropped out now, for understandable reasons, because Israel has gone so far, the prior question of why is there a Jewish state has dropped out. And that means that a lot of the analysis now, while not wrong in and of itself, in my view, lacks depth. The depth of the question of Israel comes from the Holocaust, in my view, but that also raises the question of never again to Jews, but never again to any people, especially those on the other side of our power, the Palestinian people. So the Holocaust is, it seems retro now, but this is a question of Jewish history. Israel, untied to Jewish history, has no place in history. It only makes sense within the context of Jewish history. So we can't simply abandon Israel or say it's only bad and it shouldn't exist, in my view, but we have to move through it and ask the difficult questions to Israel and its behavior. And we can do that most succinctly and with depth through the Holocaust.
And then about the maps, the maps of Palestine and the wall, the destruction. I mean, I'm sure they have been. I mean, there have been photos of that circulating already during that time. But what did you do with those photos that and those maps that made the difference?
I think it's by going through the narrative. Yes, they were circulating. And of course, first of all, a lot of people hadn't seen them, but they were circulating, and I got them off the internet, so they were circulating. But they take on a certain power within a narrative frame. You can look at the maps and just say, oh, they look awful, which they do. But if you know the history that led up to it, you can say, oh my God, because you can also map the Holocaust. See, I started writing articles, and parts of my books are mapping Jewish identity. So we have this sense of Jewish identity, who we are as Jews, but what I say is we have to map it too and say concretely, what is it? Well, Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza is part of that map. and so is the Holocaust. So I think the power, if in my view, at least the way I see it, that the visualization of the maps took on in my narrative was it was put in a narrative. I didn't just start and say, look at these maps, they're awful. People would say, yes, they are. Okay, what does it mean? So we need to, like when we map our own identity and our own journey, we have formative events in our life which show up later or help map us later. And you can't, I'm here, I'm 68, but how did I get here? And how I got here has something to do with how I am. So you could look at me and just say, here I am, but you'd want to know, well, how did he get here? Or how did they get here? Or how did you get here? And that gives more depth to who I am now. It doesn't explain it all, but just putting a picture of me and say, here's a 68-year-old. Well, you say, well, what's his life experience? What brought him here? Well, the same thing in a people's history as well. And I have been arguing for a long time from the perspective of Jewish history. And Israel makes sense within that history, and it also may be squandering that history.
Speaking of Jewish history, that seems to be, the theme, the overarching theme of the narration. Is actually a narration of your place within the history of your people. Many have described you. You were usually described as a Jewish theologian. But I remember there's one person that commented that says, well, actually, you're a Jewish historian. Well, what do you make sense of that? That in fact, actually, you were narrating your history, and that making sense of it. So are you more a historian or a theologian?
Well, actually, my rabbi said that to me. My new rabbi, or recent rabbi, who read my book, Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation, many years ago, got very upset about it. He was in rabbinical school, and he very upset about it. I don't know if he threw it against the wall, but he wanted to. And then he picked it up some years later, and he didn't throw it against the wall. And so I've had that many times too. I've had people who just throw it against the wall, but then some people who throw it against the wall who then say, you know what, there's something here that speaks to me too. So he said, I think of you more as a historian. And I think that is true in a way, but theology also comes from history. How can we talk about God without history? And how can we be faithful outside of history? And if fidelity is only in history, and God is supposed to be in history, at least in the Jewish viewpoint, then it raises the theological question. So I would say another way of describing me is a Jewish historian who raises theological questions from history. But typically people just say I'm a Jewish theologian, and I just let it go with that.
Very interesting. Okay, so let's move on to the another parts of that PowerPoint would be and you have already mentioned it about, you're putting Jews into the three categories: the Constantinian Jews, the progressive Jews, and the Jews of conscience. And it was quite controversial. And I can imagine people, being shocked to be described as a Constantinian Jew, or and the reaction. But so that must have been very not just controversial, but conflicted.
Yes, and sometimes, and like I would mention my children as being Jews of conscience, and people say, "How do you put your children in?" And I'd say, "Hey, it's my PowerPoint. You do your PowerPoint." And I would sometimes move some Jewish figures from Jews of conscience back to progressive Jews, and then they would hear about it and they would call, "What are you doing?" So it was also fun, but it's my PowerPoint, my narration. So I do what I want, and others can do what they want. But it's very important, especially after the Second Intifada, that I realized before, but more so after, that progressive Jews were the left wing of Constantinian Judaism. Constantinian Jews are those like Constantinian Christians who are enablers of oppression, who identify with the state, who get privileges from the state. So I named that Constantinian Judaism, which of course was very controversial too. And progressive Jews who were supposedly hitting against them to chart a new way in Jewish history, and they were progressive on Israel, but they didn't go far enough. And I said, basically, they're the left wing of Constantinian Judaism. What happened after the Second Intifada, especially, was there was a separation. Many of the progressive Jews went closer to Constantinian Judaism, and then there was a break. Jews of conscience said no to both. And this began a deeper exile. Jews of conscience, and I had this image of Jews of conscience walking into exile, carrying the Torah or the covenant with them. And I asked the question, what does it mean to be a rabbi in this exile, or what I now call at the end of ethical Jewish history? These Jews of conscience realized, unlike progressive Jews said, we're going to bring things back together. We're going to actually give Palestinians a state and build a wall between us, so we never have to deal with the Palestinian question. Palestinians can have their freedom, but just leave us alone. And what I said early on was, there could be no separation now. What we had done to the Palestinian people could not be undone. We had to travel with them after our confession. So we weren't going to build a wall that would separate us to return to Jewish innocence, because we couldn't. So Jews of conscience were a new phenomenon in Jewish history, and the last break in Jewish history, in a sense, to the end of ethical Jewish history. This was something completely new in our time and would not be brought together. Progressive Jews wanted Jewish renewal. We weren't going to be renewed. They wanted to return to Jewish innocence. We weren't going to return. And Israel wasn't going to be stopped. And Jews of conscience, I began to see them. Now, most Jews of conscience don't think historically or theologically. They just think, I've got to do this. This is the right thing to do. But I'm narrating, and I'm trying to understand. And Jews of conscience are a group of Jews, increasing numbers, who say, that's it. I'm done with Constantinian Judaism. I'm done with Jewish renewal or progressive Judaism or Jewishness. We're out someplace else with other exiles who are not going back either. And this is what I call the new diaspora, where Jews of conscience mingle with other peoples of conscience from all over the world who are also in exile for various reasons. And none of us are going back. Now, exiles tend to talk to another exile and say, hey, how you doing? I'm going to be returning soon. And the other one says, yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm going to return. They do that for 30, 40 years. They're not going back. It's an illusion. So Jews of conscience are actually in community with non-Jews of conscience from around the world. That's actually our new evolving tradition, not the old tradition. And we carry shattered fragments of our tradition into exile, as others do. Their shattered fragments of their traditions, and these mingle. in the new diaspora. So the Jewish Civil War, which we thought were Constantinian Jews against progressive Jews, no. The Jewish Civil War is between Jews of conscience and other Jews who aren't going to grant or work for true freedom of Palestinians and who want a Jewish renewal and the return of Jewish innocence. Jews of conscience say, no, it's not possible, and it also wouldn't be right.
Has that configuration changed in the last couple of years? Because you have named that, I think, probably in the early 2000. Has that changed now?
Well, it's grown.
Are there more Jews of conscience now, or actually there are less? What's happening?
No, of conscience, the Civil War has deepened. In a sense, it's already taken a place where it's almost completely separate communities now. So that is deepened. And of course, there's all sorts of issues with Jews of conscience too, because Jews of conscience who are in the prophetic Jewish tradition organized to overcome the exile, but the exile is not going to be overcome. So we can get a superficial understanding among Jews of conscience too, but there's no question that if you look at when I started in the 1980s and today, I have a lot more company, many more, including a lot of rabbis, including rabbis who wanted to throw my book against the wall, yes, and who told me that they have studied me, and so that's interesting. So you might say, well, my view or our view or those of us won in a way, but it's a Pyrrhic victory because it's not going to go anyplace. This is where the prophetic deepens, where fidelity in history is tested again. You might say that Jews of conscience who go into exile are testing the question of fidelity, yes, but there are deeper tests, there are more tests. As it goes on and as no return is possible. So there are many, many more Jews of conscience. But as my rabbi said to me on my 68th birthday or right around it, he said, we need you and us more than ever, because I thought maybe a lot of this is in the past, I'm looking back, but he said, we need you and us, those of us, more than ever, because Jewish history is becoming darker still. It's not, we haven't reached the end of the end. So there are many more, but there are many tests ahead.
Do the Jews of conscience, the ones carrying the prophetic, or so what happens to the progressive Jews? What do they carry? Do they carry
Nothing.
the prophetic?
Well, they carry a viewpoint that that's not possible to believe in anymore. So they're lost. Now, and therefore they tend to be gravitate toward a Constantinianism with some flourishes. But if you look at them, how they function, they've lost their power. It used to be that progressive Jews were very powerful in their own way. But in this last break, they've lost their power. Some of those progressive Jews became Jews of conscience, and therefore they moved over in my PowerPoint. But some of them went back, and therefore I moved their photo back. So you never know where you're going to end up. And that's one of the fun things about, because I can even do it if I was really technically able. During my showing of my PowerPoint, if I was able, I could move them around. But yeah, some significant figures have been lost, and some have been gained. But this was the big choice. I mean, at the first part, the break with Constantinian Judaism was big with progressive Jews on the question of Israel. Now there's another break, and that's a big break. And progressive Jews have lost their steam and really don't have a place anymore. So they're wandering in a way, but not moving deeper. They just can't, but some of them have gone and become Jews of conscience. And you'd be surprised how many people who yelled at me 20 years ago or 25 years ago, and I mean yelled at me in public, have greeted me with open arms, although they don't usually remember that they yelled at me, but I do. Well, maybe they do. I don't know if they remember, but they greet me as if we're old friends. Again, that's another thing about traveling Jewish. You know, you meet people around the world who are so grateful for you being there, and some who hate that you're there. And some that hated that loved when you were there, and then hated what you said, and then thought you were right. And you know,
Yeah, that must have been very disorienting. But yeah, but speaking of that, since you are, you have been vindicated, so to speak, and many of the things that you said are now, accepted as true. As you're right. Um, but then there, as I observed, you never wanted to be to sort of lead that movement, because it's actually a movement, Jews of conscience. Yeah, but so you would, you would be seen as a pillar of this change, of this movement. But there seems to be a resistance, refusal lead to lead a movement. So why is that?
I don't like that. I've seen leaders of these movements, progressive Jews, who become almost like cult figures. And I don't believe that thinking out loud should be to convert people or get people to follow you. I don't like that. I think everybody ought to state the truth as they see it. And if other people want to listen to it, they should. But I don't believe, first of all, there's too much at stake to make this an ego thing. When you talk about the Holocaust and the mass murder of European Jews, I can't take that lightly of now I'm going to lead the people. I don't like that. And even Israel, with all its faults, there are a lot of people in Israel and in Palestine who actually have real lives. And I don't want to become a cheerleader, even for the positions that I feel strongly about. I want to state them. I want people who want to listen and who want to think about it to listen and think about it. But I'm very wary of followers. And in fact, once, this is an interesting story, I was at Quaker University or college, and I said that it was coming near Passover, and I said, I'm not going to be celebrating Passover this year, because how can we celebrate our liberation when we're oppressing another people? And a young woman who had been raised in a mixed family got up and said, well, this is the first time I'm going to celebrate Passover. Should I? And I said, well, I'm just telling you my story now. You should celebrate. I'm not a role model. And a guy who had invited me to speak behind me came up and said, you are a role model. Tell her to celebrate Passover. And I said to him, but it could be overheard with the mic, I am not a role model, and I don't want anyone to follow me in what I'm saying. I want people to listen if they're interested. So I've experienced progressive Jews who all of a sudden become rabbis and all of a sudden sport kippahs, and I didn't like what I saw. And Jewish renewal and the movement. I don't like movements. And I think there need to be movements, but they need to have depth. And often when a movement starts, there isn't enough depth, from my perspective, And so I want to be independent. Even when Jewish Voice for Peace started, I got emails, please don't be critical. I was positive, and I am positive, but I also would be critical at times. I'm not going to just sign on, and no one should just sign on. We should work together, but there need to be independent voices. In the Jewish community, in Jewish history, there have always been independent voices that are not followers and they're not leaders. They simply state the truth as they see it. That's the prophetic tradition, in my view. And I've been criticized for it, maybe rightly, but I've also seen many of these movements come and go. Many of these spokespersons come and go. And they've all contributed something. But they've all left their mark and left the scene. We need some people to go over time and to continue to go deeper and to pay the consequences, which no one likes to, but not to be brought in. And I also felt with progressive Jews, who, when I started, they thought, who am I? And, you know, we're the leaders and who are you? But why don't you come and pray with us or eat with us? And they wanted to discipline me. They wanted me to cut my critique and feel at home with them. But you have millions of Palestinians suffering. This wasn't like, you know, let's cut the grass and have lunch. It's too damn serious. So I just found that I couldn't sign on. Now, there are some Jews of conscience that I can sign on with. Most of them are secular Jews, and I happen not to be secular, like Ilan Pappé, but he doesn't speak Jewishly, which is fine, no problem. Or Noam Chomsky, who also doesn't speak Jewishly, which is fine. But when you speak in a traditional language, there's often a desire to corral you and to discipline you and to cut your critique and to convince you to be authentically Jewish. This is the term, the authentically Jewish. And my own sense was I needed to keep distant from that. And maybe it's also partly personality.
Yes, you have always described yourself as you're not a team player.
No, I don't believe in thinking. I don't believe that thought is team. There are reasons to be part of a team. If you're cleaning up an area, you need a structure and a team. But thought and prophetic thought is not team-oriented, in my view. You need to be distant from the team, even if you support part of what the team is doing.
Okay. I would like us now to talk about the coming holidays and or the holidays in general, and what is their place in your writing.
Well, that's interesting because I'm a rebel against the religious calendars, which kind of tell you in advance what's going to happen after it happens. And each year it happens again. And everybody knows, it's like Easter, you know, Jesus is out there, Jesus dies, Jesus rises again, and everybody knows the story. And then you have a nice dinner and you wait for next year or Christmas. And in the Jewish calendar and the Islamic calendar and all religious calendars, everybody knows what's going to happen. But the people who went through these events didn't know. So it's a way of sealing the prophetic. I mean, most of religion is to announce and seal the prophetic. So you don't want to be too close to the community, to even movements for justice, and you don't want to be too close to the Jewish calendar or the Christian calendar or the Islamic calendar, in my view. However, they do mark us, the community, and raise questions. So I have often written confessional statements to be published on Yom Kippur, for instance, and have gone to Union Theological Seminary once in the early 90s. A woman told me that she heard me speak there, and I didn't know it was going to be Yom Kippur when I accepted the invitation, but then I realized it was. And instead, as a good Jew saying, I can't speak on Yom Kippur, I said to myself, if you're not going to speak publicly the confession on Yom Kippur, well, then Yom Kippur is about having gotten angry with somebody, or not cleaned up your room, or not paid attention when you pay. You know, it becomes like Lent, giving up chocolates. You know, I mean, when we were growing up, first of all, I didn't know about Christian holidays, but the idea about Christians was, some of it was really dumbed down. Like, what are you going to give up for Lent? I'm not going to smoke cigarettes for Lent. But we've become like that too. What are you going to do on Yom Kippur? We're going to confess that I got angry at you and I shouldn't, so I should go say, I'm sorry I got angry at you. No. The confession we need to make is what we have done and what we are doing to the Palestinian people. And that isn't made hardly anywhere. In Zedek, Chicago, the synagogue I now attend by Zoom because it's in Chicago. And it's good for me that it's in Chicago. I started writing about it and saying how good it was that finally a synagogue would start that is more to my liking. And but that I was glad it was 1,200 miles away, so I wouldn't have to attend it. And then I started to think, I kept saying 1,200 miles away, but how many miles is it away? And I looked it up, and it was 1,200 miles away from Orlando, which is 50 miles from where I live. So actually, I was right. You don't want to be too close. But the high holy days, Passover too, remind us of how much and how far we've strayed. So we don't want to, it becomes mindless stuff. Good food, family, giving up chocolates, telling your neighbor you shouldn't have yelled at them. This is, you know, this is silly stuff. When there's so much oppression in the world going on, and now we as Jews, who were so oppressed for so long, are oppressing another people. So I've given confessions on these days, Yom Kippur especially, and Passover, asking how can we celebrate our liberation when we're oppressing another people. So the religious calendar freezes religion. It disciplines the prophetic even as it announces it. But its main goal, its main reason now for me is to say, well, look, if we're going to say this, let's do it. If we're going to say it and not do it, we shouldn't say it at all. And distance from the religious calendar is important, but yes, the religious calendar is important. And on Rosh Hashana, Yom Kippur, and Passover, especially, I pay a lot of attention. And usually it's seen as negative by some, but very positive by others who are saying, yeah, let's get real. If we're going to confess, and we're going to be judged by God on Yom Kippur. I mean, on Yom Kippur, we say, you know, we're either written into the book of life or we're not, but we all know we're going to wake up the next day. Let's face it. But maybe one day we won't. Yeah, that's the other thing. So I'm very religious, keep a distance too.
Yeah, but when I think about that, what you're saying, that seems the word that comes to my mind is, you keep saying about this partial practice. And I don't know what is that. That seems to be a quote from a Buddhist sage about partial practice.
Yeah, he was a sage. Said as the fortunate. No, now I'm not getting it, but basically saying, fortunate are those who don't use partial practice. That is that, you know, the fortunate seekers are those who go all the way, who don't rest in a partial practice. And of course, religions are all about partial practice, especially the more pious you get. It's like wealthy in the Philippines, wealthy Catholics who have their drivers drive them to Mass and sit up in the balcony and have their attendance. This is very pious, mostly women, I think, very pious women who have the people that are essentially servants tend to them, but don't sit with them.
I hear you. Yeah. I was just wondering, and this I have heard even from Christians who celebrate those holidays, and we will talk about that later. You know, there must be some people who are saying, "Can you leave us alone? I mean, we just want to celebrate our holidays in peace." I mean, it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be always about Palestinians. Our traditions have been there even before, you know, the state of Israel with the oppression. Can you separate it? I mean, leave us alone and have a, I mean, uh, give us our, you know, give us our candles and our bread and our challah. Yeah.
Well, I celebrate Shabbat, and that's maybe a contradiction. That's another issue. So none of us are univocal and perfectly straight in different ways. But when you get to the big deal, and of course, if people want to gather on Christmas Day or Easter or Passover or Rosh Hashana, everyone should gather. But, you know, give me a break. You have in these services, you have all these high-minded phrases, a lot about justice. And if you want to skip that, just don't say that stuff. No problem. And don't have the creed. And don't have Jesus on the cross in front of you. No problem. If you don't want to be challenged by what is actually said and prayed during those days, I'm not making this up. I'm not making up the ritual. If you want to excise all of that, like Jesus going out to the poor and Jesus challenging authority for Christians, if you want to give it up, don't say that stuff during these holidays. Just say, let's have a party. You know, I think parties are good. But don't have this other where Jesus is calling you to be with the poor and follow the, or Passover is talking about liberation and our need to be free, or Yom Kippur on confession. If you want to eliminate and make Yom Kippur a disco day and with a big strobe light, go ahead and do it. And I won't complain. I mean, I think it'll be, I'll probably write about that too, but you know, you can get John Travolta and yeah, I mean, that would be interesting, but so, I mean, yeah, it's like a person talking about justice in these universities. There was just an article that my little guy circulated. He didn't write it, but circulated about all the land that was stolen from Native Americans and used to fund universities in the 1800s that were going broke, or Georgetown that sold slaves. And I mean, okay, you don't want to always be negative, but if that's the history, what are you supposed to do? Say, well, the land just landed in my lap and there was nobody there. Well, that's what Jews have often said about Palestinians, but they are there. And this land was stolen from Native Americans, even against treaties. So is that negative to point that out and to keep pointing that out? Or Black Lives Matter? Is that negative? Oh, you're so negative. You're talking about, well, blacks keep getting killed by police. So if you want to make Yom Kippur a disco night, I promise to be quiet. And I even promised that when I retire, if there was ever two real states in Israel, Palestine, I mean real, all of the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza, that I would retire and I wouldn't say another word. That was my challenge. That's not complete justice, but I would say, okay, I'll be quiet. But that's less and less and less and less and less and less likely as time goes on. So I'm not always on everyone's case, and I'm not always on my case. But if you're going to lift up values and pray about them and say they're part of your history and ethics and even salvation, and you're killing people and taking their land and humiliating them, what to do?
Yeah. Now I want to, talk about the, non-Jews or maybe Christians and Muslims who would like to participate in these holidays and as a show of solidarity, especially those synagogues or Jewish communities that would like to celebrate these holidays that is that's more attentive to the issue of justice and of course there are Christians who would you would celebrate Rosh Hashana and have their own meals too and would celebrate Passover. And I heard you heard you speak about these things in quite very critical about these Christians. Can you explain more about your criticism?
Well, first of all, people should do what they want to do, but Christians haven't been expropriating Jewish life their whole history. Edward Said wrote a book about Orientalism, where basically the West looks to the East and takes from the East and romanticizes the East, then denigrates the East. But the most Orientalist treatment of people in history, by far, is the Orientalism against Jews. Because Christians and then Muslims took the Hebrew Bible and said, you know what? They were okay or not so okay, and now it's ours. So you get the definition of the Old Testament, the Old, and the New Testament. And the New Testament supersedes the Old Testament. But we like the Old Testament because it gives us our grounding, but we really don't want to be around Jews. And somebody said, well, that's our scripture too. Yeah, you stole it. Yeah, give it back. But we need it. Yeah, but you didn't need us. Well, you needed us, but you needed us in ghettos. So, okay, that's history, and we don't want to get stuck there. That'd be very negative, wouldn't it? But I just think that people ought to be very careful. Even Jewish renewal that starts, taking Native American rights and stuff. There's this whole discussion in the United States, but probably elsewhere too, about appropriating other cultures and rituals. Well, the most appropriated culture and ritual in history, because Christianity and Islam went around the world as imperial formations with our scriptures. The most appropriated is not Native American or Black or Asian, but Jewish. Now, nobody wants to talk about that. It's okay. That seems, because they all think, well, that's our religion. But I'm very much against, for instance, Jews having Native American rights as part of our services. That's Native Americans. And if Native Americans want to invite us to share on their land and in their power, we should go. But we shouldn't do it on our own or pretend it's our own or interpret it as our own. I think this is very, but Christians appropriate everything they can find. So there's no way to stop it. And I know some of it's very genuine. But I would like to say, I love you, don't do it.
Okay, so with that, thank you. On that note, then we end this session for now. So thank you so much for the very candid, and then very challenging discussion, Professor Ellis. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I've enjoyed my time, and we've had some fun too.
Thank you. Yeah, we do. Thank you.